My name is Emily Carter. I am 34 years old, born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, and I am the co-founder of Sunstream Energy, a renewable energy startup I built from nothing. You would think that landing a $150 million deal on Christmas Eve would be the moment my family finally accepted me. But here is the twist. Just hours before that contract changed my life, my parents called me and told me I was not welcome at Christmas dinner. Not this year. Not with the kind of people they were hosting. Imagine being cut out of your own family's table on the very night that the world finally recognized you. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask for something small. If you have ever felt like the outsider in your own family, like the one who never measured up, hit the like button so I know I am not alone. Share your story in the comments because I want to hear how you dealt with it. And if you want to follow me as I lay out everything that happened, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. When the phone rang that night, I picked up expecting an ordinary holiday check-in. Instead, my mother's voice was sharp, clipped, almost rehearsed. "Emily," she said, "you are not ready to sit with us this Christmas. Not with the kind of guests we are hosting." Her words landed like glass shattering in my chest. My father's voice followed, colder, final, as if he was passing judgment. "Focus on proving yourself first, then maybe you will earn your seat at this table." The call ended with silence ringing in my ears. I sat frozen, staring at my phone, my heart pounding. That table was never just a meal. The Carter Christmas table was a stage where senators, CEOs, and high society friends gathered in our Boston brownstone. My siblings Michael and Olivia would be there, basking in applause for their perfect careers. And me? I was once again the family embarrassment, the dreamer who had not earned a place. But this year, I did not beg. I did not cry. I sat back down at my desk in my Nashville office, staring at the glowing numbers on my laptop. While they toasted champagne in crystal glasses, I was buried in spreadsheets, chasing a deal that felt impossible. Every doubt screamed in my head, every insult my parents ever threw at me echoed in the silence. But there was also something else. A fire. A stubborn refusal to let their rejection define me. Hours later, my screen lit up with the words that changed everything. Frontier Energy was signing a $150 million contract with Sunstream Energy. My name was flashing across the news before the clock struck midnight. Emily Carter, pioneer, co-founder, game changer, and in that moment, I realized something powerful. The very dinner table that had shut me out was nothing compared to the seat I had just earned on the world stage. Have you ever been told you were not enough, only to prove them wrong in the most unexpected way? Think about that and tell me in the comments, because my story was only beginning, and what came after that Christmas rejection would test me in ways I never imagined. I was born into the Carter family, and to the outside world, we were the picture of perfection. People admired us, envied us, even whispered about us in Nashville circles as if we were untouchable. My father, Richard Carter, was a towering presence, the kind of attorney who could bend a courtroom to his will with just his voice. When he walked into a room, people leaned in closer, hoping to catch whatever power seemed to trail after him. My mother, Susan, had her own throne. As a journalist whose words shaped the opinions of thousands, she was both admired and feared. Her columns in the New York Times gave her a voice louder than most politicians. Together, they were a force, a couple built on influence and reputation. Then there were my siblings. Michael was the golden boy, the kind of son who had already been chosen before he ever had to try. He moved to Los Angeles, built a reputation as a plastic surgeon, and his name lit up billboards as if he were both doctor and celebrity. Every holiday, every family event, his achievements were recited like scripture, proof that the Carters produced greatness. Olivia was no different. She was younger than me, but she stormed into Chicago's financial district as if she had been born to conquer it. She closed million-dollar deals before she was old enough to drink a glass of champagne. And my parents bragged about her with a kind of pride that left no space for anyone else. And then there was me, Emily, the daughter who never quite fit into their sharp-edged world. At those Sunday dinners in our Boston brownstone, I would sit across from them, invisible among the crystal and silver while they dissected lawsuits, surgeries, and stock markets. I can still hear the clink of knives against china, the soft laughter that seemed to rise and fall in perfect rhythm, while I sat quietly tracing solar panel designs in the margin of my napkin. The dinner table was always a battlefield dressed up in elegance. My father would slice his steak with surgical precision and without looking up ask, "Emily, why can't you be more like Michael?" My mother would sip her wine and add, "Olivia's already presenting to investors. What are you doing with those little science projects of yours?" My siblings barely needed to chime in. Michael offered smug silence, as if his achievements spoke for him, while Olivia rolled her eyes and muttered insults under her breath. And every time it happened, I swallowed my words, because I knew speaking up would only earn more ridicule. The air in that dining room always pressed down on me. The polished wood of the table gleamed like it was reflecting their success back at them. But when I looked down, all I saw was the weight of expectations I would never live up to. They thought they were pushing me toward greatness, but what they were really doing was teaching me that no matter what I did, I would never belong at that table. It was not just the words they said. It was the looks. The quick glances exchanged between my parents whenever I spoke about something I cared about. The slight curl of Michael's lips when I mentioned renewable energy. The way Olivia's fingers tapped impatiently on her phone, as if my voice was nothing more than background noise. Their disapproval did not need to be shouted. It was etched into every gesture, every pause, every sigh. But what made those dinners unbearable was the contrast. They did not dismiss me with silence. They dismissed me while exalting the others. My father's booming praise for Michael's surgeries. My mother's glowing pride when Olivia closed another deal. The applause at the table for their victories while I sat with nothing but my sketches folded in my lap. It was not just that I was overlooked. It was that I was measured against them and always found lacking. There was one evening that still burns in my memory. I must have been 16, sitting at the far end of the table while Michael described some new medical internship he had secured, and Olivia rattled off about a finance competition she had crushed. My father leaned back, pride shining in his eyes, and said, "Now this is what the Carter name represents." His gaze moved toward me just long enough to twist the knife. "Emily, take notes. This is success." I clenched my fists in my lap, nails digging into my palms, forcing myself not to speak. My mother smirked knowingly, as if she could see the rebellion brewing inside me. Olivia laughed softly under her breath and shook her head. I excused myself, muttering something about homework, but the truth was I could not breathe in that room anymore. Upstairs in my bedroom, I tore through my notebook, sketching furiously, filling the page with designs of solar grids and energy systems. Every line was a scream I could not release at the dinner table. Those nights became a pattern. They tried to mold me, to shame me, into their version of success. But the more they pushed, the more I escaped into my world of ideas. To them, my dreams were childish, fragile fantasies that would fade once I grew up. To me, they were the only place where I was not invisible. Looking back now, I understand why those dinners mattered so much. They were not just meals. They were lessons, though not in the way my parents intended. They taught me that my worth could not be found in applause at a family table. They taught me that the approval I craved would never come, no matter how hard I chased it. And they taught me to fight for a voice in a world determined to silence me. That war at the dinner table was only the beginning. I did not know it then, but every insult, every cold glance, every comparison was preparing me for the moment when I would finally walk away. The moment when I would choose my own path, even if it meant burning every bridge behind me. And that choice came sooner than anyone expected, in a way that would shatter what little connection I still had to the Carter family. When I think back on my childhood, on the endless nights of sitting silently at the Carter dinner table, there is only one memory that brings warmth instead of cold. My grandfather, George Whitman, was the only person who ever looked at me and truly saw me. He was not like the others. He did not carry himself with the sharp arrogance of my parents or the polished superiority of my siblings. George had weathered hands, a laugh that sounded like it had been carved from years of hard work, and eyes that glowed with patience. He lived in Atlanta, in a modest home that seemed out of place compared to the Carter legacy of grandeur. But to me, that house felt like freedom. Whenever my parents hosted their glittering Sunday dinners, George would slip away afterward and find me upstairs in my room, hunched over my sketches. He never mocked the pages of crude solar panels or the scribbled notes on energy efficiency. He would sit beside me, his large hands folded, nodding as if every line I drew carried the weight of possibility. "You've got something special, Emily," he would say, his voice steady, calm, certain. "Don't let them dim your light." Those words burrowed into me, deeper than any criticism my parents flung. I clung to them, repeating them in the quiet moments when the house was too heavy with judgment. My grandfather had once been an engineer, building his own small company from the ground up. He knew what it meant to start with nothing, to face laughter, to be told you were dreaming too big. Maybe that was why he believed in me. He recognized the same stubbornness in my eyes that had carried him through his own battles. One afternoon when I was 17, George handed me a book. It was old, the cover frayed, the pages yellowed and filled with notes in his handwriting. It was a book about renewable energy, a subject he had studied long before the world cared to. He placed it in my hands with a gravity that made my chest ache. "This world needs people like you," he told me. "People who imagine a future that doesn't yet exist. Promise me you won't give up, no matter what they say." I remember holding that book, running my fingers over the dog-eared pages, feeling like someone had finally placed a crown on my head. For the first time, I was not a failure, not a disappointment, not the odd one out. I was a torchbearer for a vision that mattered. His belief wrapped around me like armor, but armor can only do so much when the attacks keep coming. At 18, during one dinner that still burns in my memory, my father cut into me with words sharper than his steak knife. He said my dreams were childish, that I was wasting my potential, that one day I would look back and realize I had thrown everything away. My sister Olivia laughed, shaking her head, her phone glowing in her hand as she muttered, "Maybe if you tried harder, you'd actually matter." I felt the heat rise in my chest, the blood pounding in my ears until I could not take it anymore. I pushed my chair back and stood. No one stopped eating. No one looked up except for George. His eyes followed me as I left the table, a silent promise in his gaze that I was not alone. That night, I sat in my room with tears soaking the pages of the book he had given me. I read the same line over and over, not from the author, but from George's handwriting in the margins. "Keep going." It was George who taught me to turn pain into fuel. He would take me out on his porch when I visited his house in Atlanta, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. We would sit for hours as he told me stories about the early days of his own business, how investors slammed doors in his face, how neighbors laughed at the idea of a self-built company, how his own father had told him he would fail. "But I didn't," he would say, his grin breaking through the wrinkles, "because I decided their voices didn't get the final say. Neither do your parents, Emily. Neither does anyone who doesn't see your worth." When I was 19, I visited him one last time before he grew too sick. He was frail then, his voice softer, but his words still held the same weight. "They don't get to define you," he whispered. "You'll find your people, the ones who see you. Hold on to that, and you'll be unstoppable." I didn't know then how much those words would matter, how much they would echo years later when the loneliness nearly broke me. The night he passed, I sat on the floor of my apartment in Memphis clutching the book he had given me. I opened to the first page where his handwriting filled the corner. "Build something real." I pressed my forehead against the paper and promised him I would. Not to prove my parents wrong, not even to silence my siblings' laughter, but to honor the one person who had given me faith when no one else would. George's voice became my compass. When the rejection felt unbearable, I heard him. When failure loomed, I imagined him sitting beside me, nodding, steady, unshaken. He was the lone ally in a family that thrived on competition and comparison. And though he was gone, his belief burned brighter than their doubt ever could. But belief is one thing. Survival is another. And as I stood at the edge of adulthood, clutching a dream and a book with pages nearly falling apart, I realized I was about to make the choice that would either set me free or destroy me completely. That choice would be the first real fracture between me and the Carter family, a break that would change everything that followed. I was 20 years old when I made the decision that would sever the fragile ties I still had to my family. I had been studying engineering at Vanderbilt University, but every day I sat in lecture halls listening to professors talk about equations I had already memorized. My heart was elsewhere. My notebooks were not filled with classroom notes. They were overflowing with designs for solar panels, calculations on efficiency, and sketches of circuits I thought could change the way we powered the world. It did not take long for me to realize I was not chasing grades. I was chasing a vision. And no matter how many hours I spent in class, that vision was not going to be built from behind a desk. One spring afternoon, I walked across campus with my hands trembling. The registrar's office smelled faintly of paper and ink, the kind of place where lives were redirected with a single signature. I filled out the withdrawal forms, and as my pen scratched across the page, a strange calm washed over me. It was done. I was no longer a student at Vanderbilt. I was free. At least, that was what I told myself. The fallout at home was immediate. My father called me into the living room of our Nashville house the next weekend. His face was red, his jaw tight, his fists clenched around a coffee mug he slammed onto the table so hard I thought it might shatter. "You are throwing your life away on some pipe dream," he shouted. His voice was the same one that had swayed juries, the same one that had made headlines in court cases. But this time it was aimed at me, and it cut sharper than any verdict. My mother stood behind him, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not shout. She never needed to. Her disappointment was colder than his rage. "This is reckless, Emily," she said. "You think you are smarter than everyone else? You think you can just rewrite the rules of success?" Michael was home from Los Angeles that weekend, and he sat back in his chair with a smirk that made my blood boil. "Good luck with that," he muttered, as if my life's dream was nothing more than a failed science fair project. Olivia was the worst. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're embarrassing us," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what people will think when they hear you dropped out to chase some fantasy?" That was the moment the axe fell. My father's voice rang out like a sentence being handed down in a courtroom. "No more tuition, no allowance, no support. If you want to waste your life, you can do it on your own." The room was so silent after that, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my chest. My throat burned with unshed tears, but I refused to let them see me cry. I packed a bag that night with nothing but my notebooks, a few changes of clothes, and the old book my grandfather had given me. I moved into a cramped studio apartment in Memphis, the kind of place where the paint peeled from the walls and the faucet dripped constantly. The air smelled like mildew, and the rent was almost more than I could manage. My savings were pitiful. I picked up a job at a diner, working nights pouring coffee for truck drivers and counting crumpled dollar bills in the dark. There were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if my father had been right. Was I reckless? Was I stupid? The loneliness pressed down on me harder than the exhaustion. My classmates posted pictures of internships, frat parties, and spring breaks, while I scraped by on instant noodles and cheap coffee. Then, just when the weight felt unbearable, the phone rang. My grandfather's voice was frail, weaker than I had ever heard it, but steady all the same. "I believe in you, Emily," he said. Days later, a letter arrived in the mail. Inside was a check for $10,000, his life savings. Alongside it, written in his shaky hand, were 3 words that made my chest ache: "Build something real." I clutched that letter against my chest and cried, not just because of the money, but because it was proof that someone in this world had faith in me. It was the last time I heard from him. He passed away a month later, and the grief nearly swallowed me whole. But I carried his faith like a torch, one I could not let go out no matter how cold the world became. With that money, I bought a used laptop, some basic engineering software, and a stack of textbooks on solar technology. I turned my dingy apartment into a workshop, covering every surface with sketches and calculations. I named my project Sunstream Energy, a name that carried both light and defiance. But naming a dream is not the same as building it. Memphis was not a startup hub. I was just a dropout with a crazy idea, armed with a secondhand laptop and the ghost of my grandfather's belief. I worked double shifts at the diner to pay rent and spent every spare moment teaching myself the physics and math I needed to make my vision real. I would sketch prototypes on napkins between shifts, my hands stained with coffee and ink. It was grueling, it was lonely, and it was the beginning. Because the night I took George's letter and taped it to the wall above my desk, I promised him and myself that no matter how many times I fell, I would get back up. What I did not know then was that failure was waiting for me around every corner, and the path to building Sunstream would test me in ways that made those family dinners look like child's play. And it was in those failures, not the victories, where I would discover who I really was. The apartment I lived in during those years barely qualified as a home. The walls were yellowed with age, the pipes moaned whenever the water ran, and the smell of damp mildew never really left, no matter how much bleach I used. The windows rattled with every gust of wind off the river. I slept on a mattress that had seen better decades, surrounded by stacks of notebooks, scrap parts scavenged from thrift shops, and the battered laptop I had bought with my grandfather's last gift to me. That little apartment was where I hit the bottom, where I questioned everything, and where Sunstream Energy was first born. I spent my days at the public library, chasing down every book on renewable energy I could get my hands on. The librarians started to recognize me, whispering when I walked past because I was there so often, buried in diagrams and old journals. At night, I worked the late shift at a diner, pouring coffee for truck drivers who barely noticed me. My clothes smelled like grease. My hands were always dry from the constant scrubbing of dishes. And when I got home near dawn, I would sit cross-legged on the floor, too wired to sleep, sketching another variation of a panel design. The first prototype I built was a Frankenstein's monster of cheap materials, scavenged wires, and panels I ordered online with the last of my savings. I remember the night I finally assembled it, the excitement buzzing in my veins as if I were standing on the edge of history. The machine looked ugly, but it was mine. Every inch of it the product of my stubbornness. I flipped the switch, held my breath, and for a few seconds it worked. A faint glow lit up the bulb I had attached. I laughed out loud, my chest bursting with relief and pride. For a moment, I felt like I had cracked the code, like I could call my parents and prove to them I was not just a dreamer. But the triumph lasted less than a week. The circuits overheated, the panels cracked under stress, the wires fried and filled the apartment with the acrid smell of burnt plastic. I sat on the floor, surrounded by smoke, tears stinging my eyes, my hands shaking as I tried to salvage something from the wreckage. Nothing worked. My first invention had collapsed in on itself like a cruel joke. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling with the sound of dripping water echoing in the background, replaying every insult my family had ever thrown at me. Maybe Olivia was right. Maybe I would never matter. Maybe my father had been telling the truth when he said I was throwing my life away. I wanted to quit. I wanted to box up the pieces, throw them into the trash, and bury the humiliation deep enough that no one would ever know. But then I remembered my grandfather's handwriting in the margins of his book. Keep going. The words burned in my mind, refusing to let me surrender. So I picked myself up, wiped my face with my sleeve, and started again. Failure became my teacher. I learned that overheating meant my cooling system was weak. I learned that cracks in the panels were the result of cheap materials. I learned that my math was not wrong, but my execution was flawed. Every mistake wrote another lesson in sweat and frustration. The loneliness was the hardest part. My classmates were climbing ladders, showing off internships and degrees, while I was scraping by on tips and scavenged parts. On the nights I felt like I was drowning, I would go back to that library, burying myself in research until the fear quieted. I convinced myself that if I just worked hard enough, if I just pushed one more hour, one more night, I could silence the voices telling me I was not enough. And then something unexpected happened. One night, hunched over my laptop in a noisy Austin coffee shop, surrounded by empty cups and torn scraps of paper covered in equations, a stranger slid into the seat across from me. He was lanky, wearing a worn flannel shirt, glasses slipping down his nose. "You're the solar girl, right?" he asked, not with mockery, but with curiosity. His name was Ethan Morales. He was an energy engineer who had just come off his own failed startup. Instead of laughing at my sketches, he studied them with genuine interest. He pointed to one of my diagrams and said, "This could actually work." For the first time in years, I was not alone. That meeting changed everything. Suddenly, I had someone who understood the technical flaws I had been battling, someone who could explain the math I had been teaching myself in the dead of night. Ethan saw potential in me where my family had seen nothing but failure. He did not flinch at my messy designs or my desperation. He leaned in closer, tapped the screen, and said, "Let's fix this." The relief that washed over me in that moment was indescribable. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of my dream alone, but with Ethan sitting across from me, it felt lighter, possible. I walked out of that coffee shop with a partner, a friend, maybe even the first real ally I had found since my grandfather. But with every new step forward came bigger risks, higher stakes, and deeper tests of my resolve. Meeting Ethan was a turning point, but it was also the beginning of challenges I could not yet imagine. Because fixing a prototype was one thing. Convincing the world to believe in Sunstream Energy was something else entirely. And soon enough, we would learn how brutal that world could be. The garage we rented in Austin looked nothing like the birthplace of a company. The walls were stained with oil, the roof leaked whenever it rained, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline from the mechanic next door. But for Ethan and me, it was a sanctuary. We worked through nights that bled into mornings, our hands stained with grease and ink, our clothes damp with sweat as we wrestled with wires, circuits, and scraps of metal that we convinced ourselves could become something revolutionary. I remember the first time our prototype held together long enough to light more than a bulb. It was still clunky, still far from efficient, but it stayed alive. I let out a laugh that was half relief and half disbelief. Ethan grinned at me, his hair a mess, his glasses sliding down his nose. "Told you we'd get it," he said, and for a moment I believed him. But belief could not pay for better equipment, and the few tips I scraped together from coding side jobs were barely enough to keep us afloat. That was when Ethan told me about Grace Lee. She was a venture capitalist out of San Francisco, the kind of woman who didn't just sit through pitches, she dissected them. Ethan had met her briefly through a failed startup event. "She's tough," he warned me, "but if she sees something, she doesn't hesitate." I stayed up 3 nights in a row, preparing the pitch. My slides looked crude compared to the sleek decks I had seen online, but every number was real, every projection backed by the endless nights I had poured into the math. When the day finally came, I wore my only blazer, the fabric too tight at the shoulders, my palms slick with sweat as we entered her office. Grace was already there, seated behind a minimalist desk in a glass-walled room that overlooked the skyline. She was sharp-eyed, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable. "Emily, Ethan," she said, her tone brisk. "You've got 20 minutes." My throat went dry. I opened my laptop, projecting the slides onto the screen behind me. My voice shook at first as I explained the basics of our solar panel design, but I forced myself to steady it. I talked about efficiency, about scalability, about the flaws in current systems and how we were different. Grace interrupted often, her questions slicing through my rehearsed lines. "What's your cost per watt? What about long-term degradation? How do you plan to handle heat dissipation?" Each question felt like a test I wasn't sure I could pass. I glanced at Ethan, who jumped in with technical answers, his voice calm, his confidence grounding me. Together, we volleyed back her doubts, and slowly I felt my footing return. By the time I closed with our vision for Sunstream Energy, my heart was hammering so hard I thought the room could hear it. Grace leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notebook. For a long moment, she said nothing. I held my breath, the silence stretching until it felt unbearable. Then she spoke. "You've got guts," she said, "and just enough numbers to back it up. I'll put in 50,000. The words hung in the air like a lifeline. My knees almost buckled with relief. $50,000. To most people in her world, it was a small seed investment. To us, it was oxygen. Ethan grinned at me, and I could barely stop myself from crying right there in her office. With Grace's money, we rented a small workspace, bought better equipment, and hired 2 part-time coders who believed in our mission. For the first time, Sunstream Energy felt like more than a dream scribbled in a notebook. It was becoming real. Our first real project was installing a solar panel system for a warehouse in Dallas. It was the chance to prove to Grace, to ourselves, and to the world that we could deliver. Ethan and I poured everything into it. We worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the back of the workspace, surviving on takeout and energy drinks. I remember tracing wires until my hands cramped, Ethan adjusting algorithms until his eyes were bloodshot. We told ourselves that once this installation succeeded, everything would change. But the truth is, nothing prepares you for failure when you've staked your entire future on it. Within a week of the installation, the warehouse manager called. The panels had overheated. The circuits had fried. Our system, the one we had staked years of sweat and hope on, had collapsed. I drove out to Dallas with Ethan to see it myself. Standing there in the Texas heat, staring at the blackened remains of our prototype, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath me. The acrid smell of burnt wiring clung to my clothes, to my skin. I could not breathe. That night, I sat on the floor of our workspace, staring at the wreckage we had hauled back. My hands were black with soot, my heart hollow. I thought of my father's voice, sharp and final. "You're throwing your life away." I thought of my mother's cold dismissal. "This is reckless." And for the first time since I had dropped out of Vanderbilt, I wondered if they had been right. Grace's emails grew shorter, her calls colder. I could feel her patience slipping, and I knew we were hanging by a thread. I looked at Ethan, who was tossing a burnt wire aside, his expression steady. "Failures are data," he said simply. "Now we know what went wrong. We fix it." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of my family's rejection and the sting of this very public failure pressed down on me until I could barely move. I told him maybe it was over. Maybe we had already proven my parents right. He shook his head, a stubborn light in his eyes. "No, we haven't even started yet." In that moment, I realized the road ahead was going to be harder than anything I had imagined, and what came next would either break us completely or force us to rise from the ashes stronger than before. The warehouse disaster left a scar so deep, I thought it would never heal. For weeks after, I could not walk into our workspace without feeling my chest tighten, as though the charred fragments of that project were still choking the air. Grace did not pull her funding, but I could hear the strain in her voice every time she called. Her tone was cooler, her words shorter, as if she was already preparing to cut ties. The shame was unbearable. I thought of the warehouse manager's face when he told me he wanted his deposit back. I thought of the news articles that might one day describe us as another failed startup that never made it out of the garage. But Ethan refused to let me wallow. He treated the failure like it was a lab experiment, not a death sentence. One evening, while I sat at my desk staring blankly at the same page of calculations for the 100th time, he dropped a stack of printed research papers in front of me. "Look at this," he said. "New photovoltaic cells, better heat management, higher efficiency. This is where we pivot." I hated the word pivot. To me, it felt like admitting defeat, like saying we had built something broken. But he was right. We could not keep doing the same thing and expect the world to forgive us. So we tore everything apart. Every design, every calculation, every assumption. We started again from scratch. The nights became longer than ever. We scavenged parts from old electronics, sold off whatever equipment we could not use, and ran simulations on laptops that overheated faster than our prototypes. My hands blistered from soldering, my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets until dawn. There were nights when we argued until our voices were hoarse, me insisting we did not have the money or time, him insisting that we could not afford not to try. Somewhere in that chaos, in the exhaustion and frustration, a new design was born. The first time we tested the new panels, I braced myself for the familiar smell of burning wires, but it did not come. The system held. The efficiency readings climbed higher than we had ever achieved before. 20%, then 21, then 22. Ethan whooped so loudly I nearly jumped out of my chair. For the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten: hope. With that new design in hand, we started small. A brewery in Denver agreed to let us install panels on their roof. I remember standing there on the day of installation, the Colorado sun beating down on us, my heart pounding as if the panels were a lifeline. And when they worked, when the system stayed cool and steady, the owner clapped me on the back and said, "You might just be onto something here." That single sentence was worth more than gold. After the brewery came a community center, then a small factory. None of the contracts were huge, but they were enough. Enough to prove that we were not frauds. Enough to put Sunstream's name in a handful of industry blogs. I remember reading one headline late at night: "Promising startup makes strides in solar efficiency." The word promising leapt off the page, and I printed it out, taping it above my desk as if it were scripture. But success has a way of stirring old wounds. I started to imagine what it would be like to call home, to tell my parents that I had finally built something that worked, that people were starting to notice. December was approaching, and I let myself hope for the smallest sliver of acceptance. I dialed my mother's number, my hand trembling as the phone rang. She answered with her usual clipped tone. I told her about the brewery, the community center, the blogs. I told her we had created something real, something that was beginning to matter. There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that tells you everything before the words even come. "Emily," she said, "we're hosting senators and CEOs this Christmas. People who have truly made it. You're not ready to sit with them." Then my father's voice came on, flat and final. "Come back when you've got something real to show." I hung up with my throat burning and my hands shaking. I had thought the small victories would be enough to prove to them that I was not just a dreamer. But to them, it was never enough. Nothing ever would be. I stared at the taped article above my desk until the words blurred. Promising startup. The world was starting to see me, even if my own family never would. That night, I told Ethan we needed to aim higher. Bigger clients, bigger risks. If I could not win my family's respect with small victories, then I would go after something they could not ignore. What I did not know then was that this hunger, this desperate drive to prove myself, would push us into the most dangerous gamble of our lives. One that would come to a head on a night when the world celebrated Christmas, and I faced the greatest test of my entire journey. Christmas Eve in Nashville had always carried a certain weight for me. The city glowed with lights strung across rooftops, store windows filled with glittering displays, and families rushing home with armfuls of gifts. But for me, the holiday had become a reminder of exclusion, of that table in Boston where my family gathered without me. This time, though, instead of standing outside the window of my own family's life, I was staring at a chance that could rewrite everything. Frontier Energy had sent me an email 2 days earlier. They were impressed with our pitch, but they wanted proof that we could fix one glaring flaw. Our heat dissipation system still wasn't perfect. Their message was short and merciless. "Fix this by tonight, or the deal is off the table." It was Christmas Eve. The world outside was celebrating, but for me, the countdown had just begun. I remember sitting alone in the office when that message came in. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me seemed louder than usual, as though the universe itself was reminding me of how empty the room was. My first instinct was panic. My chest tightened, my hands trembled against the keyboard, and I thought of my father's words echoing through the years. "Come back when you've got something real to show." Frontier was giving me one night to prove him wrong, to prove everyone wrong. I called Ethan. He was halfway through his mother's pecan pie in Austin, and I could hear the noise of laughter and clinking glasses in the background. But before I could even finish explaining, he said, "I'm on my way." No hesitation. That was Ethan. By 3 o'clock, he was at the office door, his hair still tousled from the drive, a coffee in one hand and his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't waste a second. "All right," he said, setting the coffee down with a thud. "Let's fix this thing." The hours that followed felt like a blur and a battle. We ripped through schematics, tore apart models, and scrawled equations across the whiteboard until the ink ran dry. My hands shook from too much caffeine, my vision blurred from exhaustion, but every time I faltered, Ethan pushed us forward. At one point, he found a flaw in the ventilation design and suggested a new alloy for the heat sinks. His voice carried that rare spark of excitement I had seen in him only once before, back when we had first hit 22% efficiency. This could push us to 25, he said, eyes gleaming. I recalculated the output, running the numbers again and again until the results stabilized on the screen. Better, cleaner, stronger than anything we had built before. My heart raced as I typed up the revisions, my fingers flying across the keys, even as my shoulders ached. The clock on the wall ticked past 8 o'clock, then 9. Outside, the city was quieting as families settled in for midnight services or curled up by fireplaces. In our office, the only sound was the furious clicking of keys and the scratch of markers against whiteboard. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. If we failed tonight, the $150 million deal would evaporate, and with it, years of sacrifice. If we succeeded, everything could change. At 9:47 p.m., I hit send. My stomach twisted as the email left my outbox. Attached was the new proposal, the refined design, and a desperate hope that it would be enough. The silence after was unbearable. Ethan slumped onto the couch, running his hands through his hair. I paced the office, my chest tight, my phone clutched in my hand as I could will it to ring. The minutes dragged on like hours. I thought of my family sitting around their gleaming table, sipping wine with senators and CEOs. I imagined my mother laughing, my father holding court, Olivia making connections, Michael being admired. And I thought of me, alone in a dimly lit office, waiting to find out if everything I had sacrificed had been for nothing. At 10:15 p.m., the screen lit up. Susan Lynn, Frontier's director. I opened the email with shaking hands, my breath caught in my throat. The words blurred for a second before they came into focus. Your solution checks out. We're signing the contract. $150 million. Congratulations. I couldn't breathe. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and overwhelming. Ethan jumped up, grabbing my shoulders. We did it, he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty office. I laughed through the tears, my chest aching with relief, disbelief, and joy all tangled together. I turned on the television, almost in a daze, and there it was. Breaking news. Nashville-based startup Sunstream Energy secures record contract with Frontier Energy. My name flashed across the screen. Emily Carter, co-founder, pioneer. They called us industry leaders. I sat there frozen, watching the world say out loud what my family never had, that I mattered. That night, while others unwrapped gifts beneath twinkling trees, I unwrapped something I had chased my entire life. Validation. Not from my parents, not from my siblings, but from the world. I did not call home. I did not send a message. Because in that moment, I realized I no longer needed their table. I had built my own. But victories, even ones that taste that sweet, carry consequences. And as the news spread, I knew it would not be long before the Carters came knocking, ready to claim a piece of the empire they had once dismissed. The morning after the Frontier deal was announced, my office phone would not stop ringing. Reporters wanted quotes, local officials wanted interviews, competitors wanted to know who we were and how we had managed to leapfrog the industry overnight. I was running on 2 hours of sleep and more caffeine than blood, but I felt untouchable. For the first time in my life, I had built something the world could not ignore. At 9 a.m., the receptionist buzzed me. Her voice carried a note of hesitation I had never heard before. Emily, your family is here. For a second, I thought I had misheard. My family had not stepped foot in my world for years. They had made it clear that my life was a disappointment, a stain on the Carter name. Yet when I walked into the lobby, there they were. My father in his tailored suit, the same kind he wore to court when he wanted to intimidate. My mother with her perfect posture and polished smile, her eyes scanning the space as though she was already rehearsing how she would describe it to her colleagues. And Olivia, sharp as ever in a blazer that screamed money and influence. Michael, of course, was absent. He was probably too busy plastering his face across billboards in Los Angeles. The moment was surreal. For years, they had shut me out, and now they were standing in my lobby, surrounded by my staff, pretending as though they belonged. My father stepped forward first, his smile practiced but hollow. Emily, we saw the news, he said, extending his hand. What an achievement. Truly remarkable. My mother followed, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. We're so proud of you, she said. For a second, I almost believed her. Almost. But then Olivia spoke, and the illusion shattered. I know investors who would love to meet you, she said, her eyes sharp and calculating. We could set up introductions, help you scale. It would be good for Sunstream. There it was, the real reason they were here. Not pride, not love, opportunity. They wanted a seat at a table they had once told me I was unworthy of. I felt my chest tighten, the years of silence pressing down on me, the dinners where I had been mocked, the nights I had cried into my notebook, the holidays I had spent alone while they toasted their successes, and now suddenly they wanted in. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, and I heard my own voice come out steady, but colder than I intended. You're proud now? When I was pouring coffee in a diner to make rent, where were you? When I dropped out of Vanderbilt to chase this, you called me reckless. When my first prototype burned out, you never even asked if I was okay. My father raised an eyebrow, surprised by my defiance. He had always expected me to shrink under his gaze, but I was not the same girl who had sat silently at his dinner table. Emily, we just want to support you now, he said, his tone dripping with the kind of patronizing authority he used in court. I shook my head, my voice firm. You don't get to support me now that it's easy. You didn't believe in me when it was hard. You don't get to claim this. My mother's face tightened, the softness gone, replaced by the sharpness I remembered all too well. We're your family, she said, as though the word alone should erase everything they had done. Family doesn't tell you you're not enough, I replied. Family doesn't cut you off when you need them most. Family doesn't show up only when the cameras are rolling. Olivia scoffed, folding her arms. You're being dramatic, she muttered. We're here, aren't we? I looked at them, each of them dressed to perfection, polished and untouchable, standing in a lobby they had no right to occupy. They hadn't changed. They weren't here for me. They were here because the news had told them I mattered, and that was the cruelest part. You're here because the world told you to be, I said, my voice low and final. I built this without you. I don't need your investors. I don't need your approval. I never did. For a moment, silence filled the room. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. You're making a mistake, he said. You'll need us someday. I almost laughed. I needed you 10 years ago, I said. I don't anymore. My mother reached out, her hand hovering just inches from my arm. Let's talk this over at lunch, she offered, her voice smooth, coaxing. We can celebrate properly. I stepped back. I've got work to do. You know the way out. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Olivia muttered something under her breath, but I didn't care to listen. I turned my back on them and walked toward my office, each step heavier than the last, but also freer. For the first time in my life, I had drawn a line they could not cross. When I reached my office, Ethan was standing by the door, holding 2 cups of coffee. He had been watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. He handed me 1 cup and said, "That was badass." I managed a small smile, though my heart was still racing. Walking away from them felt final, like slamming shut a door I had left cracked open for far too long. I sat at my desk, the Nexus contract glowing on my screen, and realized that this was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was enough. Yet even as I tried to breathe through the adrenaline, I knew this confrontation was not the end. My family had never been the kind to accept defeat, and I could feel it in the silence they left behind that this was only the beginning of their attempts to reclaim me, to rewrite the story in which they had always been the heroes. 6 months after signing the Frontier deal, the world around me looked completely different. Sunstream Energy was no longer just a dream scrawled in my notebook or a fragile prototype in a leaking garage. It had become a living, breathing company, with an office buzzing with new hires, contracts that kept growing, and panels that powered half of Nashville's public buildings. Every morning when I walked into that space, I could feel the hum of possibility in the air, the kind that reminded me why I had fought so hard when the world told me I was not enough. But what mattered most wasn't just the business. It was the people who had chosen to stand beside me when everything seemed impossible. Ethan, with his stubborn optimism, who turned every failure into data and never let me give up. Grace, who had been ruthless with her questions but steady with her faith when it counted most. And Sophia, the brilliant scientist who challenged me in ways that went beyond technology and taught me what it meant to be truly seen. Together, They became the family I didn't know I was allowed to have. With the success of Sunstream, I finally had the chance to honor the one person who had believed in me from the very beginning. I started the George Whitman Scholarship, a program that gave young innovators a chance to pursue ideas that others dismissed as impossible. At the opening ceremony, I held the book he had given me, its pages still worn, its corners still dog-eared. I looked out at the faces of students holding their own sketches, their own fragile dreams, and I told them what I wish someone had told me when I was their age. Your worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Build anyway. Dream anyway. And when they tell you it's not real, prove them wrong. Looking back now, I understand the true cost of chasing approval. I wasted years begging for a seat at a table that was never meant for me, when what I needed all along was to build my own. The truth is, rejection can be painful, but it can also be fuel. Every door that closed forced me to carve out a new path, one that led me to something greater than I had ever imagined. If there is anything I want you to take from my story, it is this. Do not let anyone else define the limits of your life. The people who doubt you will always be louder than the ones who believe, but it is your belief that matters most. Sometimes the family you choose, the people who meet you on your journey and lift you up, are the ones who make all the difference. So if you have ever felt like you were on the outside looking in, if you have ever been told you were not enough, let my story remind you that you are. Sit with your dreams, hold them close, and keep building. If this story resonated with you, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And let me leave you with this question. If you stopped chasing someone else's approval, what would you dare to build for yourself?